The archival record opens without emphasis. A sequence of routine documents, dated and numbered, survives in partial form. A maintenance card lists an aircraft by serial, its engine hours tallied in neat columns, its armament checked and signed off in blue pencil. A weather report notes high cloud and variable visibility above the operational ceiling. A radar log records intermittent contacts at range, strength uncertain, tracks merging and separating. Fuel allocation sheets show no irregularities. Ammunition issue forms indicate full load, countersigned, with no annotations added later. In the combat report ledger, one line is underlined twice, the graphite pressed harder than elsewhere. The entry does not describe an engagement outcome. It records a return time, an airframe condition, and a remark added after the main text, aligned slightly lower, as if inserted when space had already been accounted for. The remark concerns expended ammunition, marked complete. There is no citation explaining why the aircraft returned intact. No summary was appended. The folder ends with a routine transfer stamp and a date several weeks later, when paper shortages prompted consolidation. The remaining documents persist without clarification, filed among hundreds of similar records that do not draw attention on their own. The operational context, as preserved in routine paperwork, reflects no deviation from established procedures. Squadron readiness reports for the week show full serviceability within acceptable margins. Aircraft availability fluctuated within normal limits due to scheduled inspections and minor mechanical rectifications. The aircraft in question appears repeatedly in these lists, neither highlighted nor delayed, its status marked as operational on each relevant morning. The armament configuration is recorded in standardized shorthand, indicating synchronized machine guns and cannon loaded to regulation capacity. No experimental fittings or field modifications are noted. Flight orders issued on the day in question follow a familiar pattern. Patrol zones are assigned by grid reference, altitude bands specified with tolerances, and time on station calculated against fuel endurance under average consumption rates. The assigned mission falls within a sector previously classified as moderately active. Intelligence summaries attached to the orders list enemy air activity as intermittent, with formations observed at varying altitudes during the preceding days. No extraordinary threat level is indicated. The orders bear the signatures of the duty operations officer and the squadron commander, consistent with standard authorization practice. Meteorological data compiled at dawn describe layered cloud cover, broken at mid-altitude, with higher strata thinning toward the operational ceiling. Wind speed and direction are logged at multiple levels, their projected drift values annotated for navigation purposes. Visibility is assessed as sufficient for visual interception under most conditions. These reports are duplicated across several units operating from the same airfield, suggesting no localized anomaly affecting a single sortie. Ground crew logs document pre-flight inspections conducted according to checklist. Control surfaces are verified, engine run-up completed without irregular readings, oil pressure and coolant temperature falling within prescribed ranges. Ammunition feed belts are checked and reseated, safety pins removed and accounted for. The aircraft's logbook records the pilot's acknowledgement of readiness, entered with a brief signature and time stamp. No marginal notes appear in the margins, and no subsequent corrections are attached. The airfield itself is described indirectly through logistical returns. Fuel bozers are inventoried, spare parts tallied, and personnel duty rosters posted. The rhythm of operations is implied rather than stated, inferred from repeated timestamps and overlapping sorties. Aircraft depart in intervals consistent with staggered patrol coverage. The subject aircraft is scheduled among the first wave, its takeoff time aligned with the opening of the patrol window. Radio frequency allocations for the mission are standard. Primary and secondary channels are assigned, with fallback procedures outlined in the event of interference or equipment failure. Signal discipline reminders are included in the briefing notes, emphasizing brevity and clarity. There is no indication that radio silence was expected beyond normal tactical discretion. The communication plan reflects routine expectations of contact and coordination. Radar station logs from the same period list several plots emerging at long range. These are annotated with estimated headings and speeds, some later crossed out as false returns or merged tracks. One track, marked with a sequential identifier, aligns temporally with the patrol's projected interception area. The notation remains tentative, with question marks appended to altitude estimates. No urgent alerts are issued at this stage, and no scramble orders are recorded beyond those already planned. The patrol composition is recorded as a standard pair formation, though subsequent paperwork suggests that aircraft spacing varied during execution. Formation doctrine manuals referenced in training appendices emphasize flexibility under cloud conditions, allowing pilots to adjust separation while maintaining visual contact when possible. These manuals are filed separately but referenced implicitly through adherence to their guidelines in operational planning. Fuel consumption estimates are recalculated mid-mission according to standard practice, though the calculations themselves survive only as pre-printed tables in the flight folder. The aircraft's fuel load, recorded at takeoff, allows for the assigned patrol duration with a reserve margin. No contingency for extended engagement is explicitly noted, though standing orders permit discretionary extension if tactical circumstances require. Enemy aircraft recognition sheets distributed to pilots include silhouettes and performance notes. The sheets for this period are worn, their edges frayed, suggesting frequent handling. Marginal pencil marks appear on some copies, but the version preserved in the archive is clean, with no personal annotations. It lists expected armament configurations and recommended engagement ranges, reflecting current intelligence assessments. Maintenance summaries compiled after the previous day's operations list no unresolved defects. Minor issues, such as radio static and intermittent instrument flicker, are marked as rectified. The aircraft's engine hours increment steadily across entries, with no sudden jumps or unexplained gaps. The cumulative record presents an airframe operating within its expected life cycle. The takeoff itself is not directly described in surviving documents, but its occurrence is inferred from time stamps and subsequent entries. Control tower logs note departures at regular intervals, each marked with a call sign and runway designation. Weather observations at the moment of departure remain consistent with earlier forecasts. No aborted takeoffs or emergency returns are recorded during this window. Once airborne, the patrol's movement is reconstructed through indirect sources. Radio logs capture brief transmissions acknowledging course changes and altitude adjustments. These transmissions are logged without content detail, reduced to call sign, time, and signal strength. The brevity of these entries reflects standard logging practice rather than an absence of communication. The operational area is defined by grid references repeated across documents. Maps accompanying the mission orders show these grids overlaid on terrain features, coastlines, or infrastructure, depending on theater. The particular sector assigned includes a mix of open space and navigational landmarks, offering visual reference points under broken cloud conditions. No restrictions or no-fly zones are marked within the patrol area. Enemy activity reports compiled later in the day summarize sightings reported by multiple units. These summaries list approximate numbers and headings but avoid precise engagement details unless confirmed. The patrol in question is mentioned only as having reported contact, with no elaboration at this stage. The absence of detail suggests either pending debrief or a classification of the contact as routine. Standard engagement rules applicable at the time are outlined in separate directives. These rules emphasize identification before engagement, conservation of ammunition, and avoidance of prolonged pursuit beyond assigned sectors. The directives are referenced implicitly through compliance checklists included in mission paperwork. There is no indication that exceptions were anticipated for this sortie. The aircraft's armament specifications are detailed in technical manuals archived separately. These manuals list rates of fire, ammunition types, and expected dispersion patterns. Ammunition capacity figures are precise, down to individual rounds per gun. These figures provide the baseline against which later notations of expended ammunition are understood. Training records for the pilot assigned to the aircraft show completion of required gunnery exercises. Scores are recorded numerically, with comments limited to standardized phrases. Recent training flights indicate no anomalies. The pilot's name appears frequently across routine documents, suggesting regular operational tempo rather than exceptional assignment. Operational fatigue assessments compiled weekly list flying hours per pilot. The figures for the relevant period fall within accepted limits. No rest exemptions or medical notes are attached. The pilot is cleared for duty without restriction. As the patrol proceeds, the convergence of radar plots and visual sightings is noted in subsequent summaries. The timing aligns with the patrol's mid-mission phase. However, the surviving documents refrain from narrative description. Instead, they present discrete data points, times, positions, headings. These fragments imply proximity without detailing interaction. The aircraft's radio equipment specifications are listed in technical appendices. Range and reliability under various conditions are described in measured terms. The logs show no equipment failure reports during the mission window. Signal strength entries remain consistent, suggesting continued functionality. Fuel state calculations recorded after landing indicate expected consumption up to the point of return. The reserve margin is reduced but not exceeded. These calculations are annotated with standard abbreviations and verified by ground staff signatures. Throughout the documentation, the absence of emphasis remains notable. No document flags the mission as atypical during its execution phase. The context remains that of a standard patrol conducted under ordinary wartime conditions, framed by procedures designed to absorb routine contact and engagement without special notation. The scene concludes, within the bounds of available records, at the threshold of recorded engagement. The operational context is fully established through its ordinariness, preserved in forms, tables, and logs that continue uninterrupted up to the moment when ammunition expenditure would later be marked as complete. The transition from routine patrol to recorded engagement occurs through incremental entries rather than a single defining moment. Radar station plots update at 5-minute intervals, showing convergence between the patrol's projected track and a cluster of returns moving on a reciprocal heading. The altitude estimates remain inconsistent, with overlapping figures suggesting vertical separation within the formation. The patrol's acknowledgement of the plot is logged as received, time-stamped, and filed without comment. Aircraft positioning reports indicate a gradual climb to the upper limit of the assigned altitude band. Engine performance readings inferred from later maintenance checks suggest sustained high power settings during this phase. Oil temperature and coolant readings, reconstructed from post-flight data, remain within tolerance, though trending upward as expected under load. Fuel flow rates correspond to these settings, reducing reserve margins incrementally. Visual contact is inferred from a brief radio log entry noting, sighting confirmed, logged without elaboration. The timing corresponds with the radar plot tightening into a more coherent track. Subsequent radio entries show minor course corrections, each acknowledged and time-stamped. Formation spacing appears to widen slightly, inferred from differential signal strengths recorded by the ground station. The first expenditure of ammunition is not recorded in real time but reconstructed through later reconciliation. Armament counters recovered during post-flight inspection show initial reductions consistent with a short burst from the primary guns. The timing of this expenditure aligns with the moment radar operators annotate a sudden dispersion in the enemy track, several returns diverging in heading and altitude. Subsequent radio logs indicate increased transmission frequency, though content remains unrecorded. Signal strength fluctuates, suggesting maneuvering and changes in relative orientation. The patrol's altitude is adjusted downward in stages, consistent with pursuit or repositioning. These changes are mirrored in the radar plots, which show rapid vertical movement among multiple contacts. Ammunition expenditure accelerates during the next recorded interval. Technical analysis of remaining rounds after landing indicates multiple firing sequences, likely of varying duration. The pattern of depletion suggests both short controlled bursts and at least one sustained firing event. The precise targets of these firings are not identified in surviving records. Enemy aircraft behavior is reconstructed from fragmentary intelligence summaries compiled later that day. These summaries note evasive maneuvers, including sharp turns and rapid dives, reported by several units operating in adjacent sectors. One entry references an aircraft breaking formation and descending rapidly, though without attribution. The timing corresponds with the patrol's engagement window. The patrol's fuel consumption continues to increase as power settings remain elevated. Calculations performed post-flight show that the aircraft's remaining fuel at the point of disengagement was approaching the lower bound of the planned reserve. No emergency fuel status is declared in the radio logs, suggesting the situation remained within acceptable limits. Ammunition counters reach zero sequentially rather than simultaneously, as later inspection reveals uneven depletion across gun positions. This pattern indicates continued firing until individual guns exhausted their belts. The final cessation of fire is inferred from the complete absence of remaining rounds, noted succinctly in the armament log as expended. At this juncture, the aircraft remains airborne and within proximity of enemy contacts, as indicated by radar plots still showing multiple returns in the vicinity. The patrol's radio transmissions become more sporadic, possibly reflecting increased workload or tactical discretion. One transmission is logged as partially received, signal strength degraded. Enemy records, accessed post-war, include a combat report from a unit operating in the same sector. The report describes an engagement with a single opposing fighter that continued maneuvering aggressively despite apparent cessation of fire. The report notes the absence of visible muzzle flashes during the latter phase of the encounter, though this observation is presented without interpretation. The aircraft's subsequent maneuvers are reconstructed through a combination of radar data and inferred flight performance. The plots show a series of abrupt heading changes and altitude variations, consistent with defensive maneuvering. The aircraft does not break away immediately but remains within the engagement area for several minutes after ammunition depletion. Structural stress indicators assessed during post-flight inspection reveal no evidence of over-limit loads, suggesting maneuvers remained within the aircraft's design envelope. Control surface linkages show no signs of damage or excessive wear. The airframe's integrity appears uncompromised throughout the engagement. Enemy intelligence summaries compiled later include a note of a fighter observed returning to base with damage consistent with near misses rather than direct hits. The attribution of this damage is uncertain, and no claim is formally linked to the patrol. The timing, however, aligns with the early phase of ammunition expenditure. As the engagement disperses, radar plots show enemy returns thinning and moving away from the patrol area. The patrol's track begins to straighten, heading back toward friendly territory. Altitude stabilizes at a mid-range level, suggesting a transition from combat maneuvering to cruise configuration. Fuel state calculations indicate that continued pursuit would have risked reserve depletion. The decision to disengage is not explicitly recorded but is implied by the change in heading and reduction in power settings inferred from engine data. The aircraft's speed decreases gradually, consistent with a return flight profile. Radio logs record a brief transmission acknowledging disengagement and return course. The content is not preserved, but the acknowledgement timestamp marks the end of recorded combat activity. Signal strength improves as the aircraft closes distance with friendly ground stations. Enemy records include a final note of the opposing fighter departing the area without firing further. No claims of destruction or loss are associated with the encounter in these records. The absence of claims suggests either inconclusive results or a lack of visual confirmation. The return flight proceeds without further incident. Weather conditions remain stable, and navigation is assisted by ground references visible through breaks in the cloud layer. Fuel consumption returns to nominal cruise rates, preserving a minimal reserve upon arrival. Landing is logged at the assigned airfield within the expected time window, adjusted for the extended engagement. Control tower records note a normal approach and touchdown. No emergency signals are recorded, and the aircraft taxis to its dispersal area under its own power. Post-flight inspection begins immediately, following standard procedure. Ground crew note the complete absence of ammunition during armament checks. The notation, expended, is entered in the log without embellishment. Airframe inspection reveals no combat damage requiring immediate repair. Engine inspection shows elevated but acceptable temperatures during the engagement, with no signs of overheating damage. Oil levels are within expected limits given the sortie duration. Minor residue consistent with sustained high-power operation is cleaned as part of routine servicing. The pilot's debrief form includes a checkbox indicating ammunition expended. The narrative section contains minimal text, limited to grid references and times. No extraordinary remarks are added. The form is signed and filed. Enemy documentation, reviewed later, remains inconclusive regarding the outcome of the encounter. Multiple units report contact but no confirmed losses or victories. The opposing fighters' continued maneuvering without visible fire is noted but not analyzed. The chronological record concludes this phase with the aircraft secured, serviced, and returned to operational status. The event exists in the archive as a sequence of timestamps, counters, and checkmarks, marking the passage of a sortie that progressed from standard patrol through sustained engagement and back again without deviation from documented procedure. The opposing side's archival material begins with unit daily summaries compiled at the end of the same operational period. These summaries follow a standardized format: weather, readiness, sorties flown, contacts observed. In the weather section, cloud cover and visibility are described in terms matching those recorded on the other side of the front, suggesting shared atmospheric conditions across the operational area. Wind strength and direction are noted as moderate, with turbulence reported near cloud boundaries. No anomalies are flagged. Readiness tables list aircraft serviceability by type and serial block. Several machines are marked as operational at dawn, with one aircraft assigned to a patrol overlapping the grid references later associated with the engagement. Its armament load is recorded as standard, with ammunition quantities matching regulation figures. The pilot assigned is identified by rank and service number, without additional annotation. Sortie logs show takeoff times and headings. The aircraft of interest departs within a routine patrol window, climbing to an altitude band similar to that recorded by the opposing side. The log notes formation spacing adjustments shortly after departure, attributed to cloud cover. No special orders or deviations are recorded in the margin. Early radar or observer reports from the opposing side note faint contacts approaching the patrol sector. These reports are fragmented, combining ground observer notes with rudimentary plotting. One observer station records a single fast mover at high altitude, heading toward the patrol's assigned area. The estimate is marked as uncertain, with a question mark next to the altitude figure. As the patrol proceeds, the opposing side's radio logs record brief exchanges between the aircraft and its ground control. These exchanges are summarized rather than transcribed, indicating acknowledgement of vectors and altitude adjustments. The tone of the entries remains routine, with no escalation markers or priority flags. The first indication of contact appears in a combat report drafted later but referencing the time stamp of the engagement. The report states that visual contact was made with an opposing fighter at a higher altitude, descending rapidly. The description is concise, limited to relative position, estimated speed, and initial maneuvering. No assessment of intent or outcome is included. Ammunition expenditure on the opposing side is recorded through gun camera usage logs and post-flight armament checks. These logs indicate intermittent firing during the engagement window. The firing pattern suggests short bursts rather than sustained fire. The total rounds expended fall below half of the aircraft's carried load, according to the armament ledger. The opposing pilot's combat report includes a section for enemy behavior. In this section, the opposing fighter is described as continuing to maneuver aggressively after initial exchanges. The report notes that, During later phases, no muzzle flashes were observed from the enemy aircraft, despite its continued proximity and apparent attempts to position for attack. This observation is recorded without speculation, presented as a visual fact. Ground observer reports from nearby stations corroborate the presence of two aircraft maneuvering at varying altitudes. Observers note sharp turns, dives, and climbs, with contrails appearing intermittently above cloud breaks. One observer records a prolonged turning engagement lasting several minutes, after which the aircraft separate. No crash or explosion is observed. The opposing side's radar plots, though less precise than those of the other side, show two returns merging and separating repeatedly. The plots indicate rapid changes in altitude, inferred from signal strength variations. At one point, one return maintains altitude while the other descends briefly before climbing again. The records do not assign identities to the returns. Maintenance records compiled after the opposing aircraft's return show no structural damage. The airframe inspection notes minor surface residue consistent with high-speed maneuvering. Control surfaces are checked and found within tolerance. The engine inspection records elevated temperatures but no exceedances. Ammunition remaining is counted and logged, with figures matching those noted in the armament ledger. The opposing pilot's debrief form includes a narrative section filled with brief, factual statements. The narrative lists the time of contact, approximate grid reference, altitude, and duration of engagement. It notes that the enemy aircraft remained airborne and disengaged without visible damage. No claims are made. The form is signed and dated. Intelligence summaries compiled by the opposing side later that day aggregate multiple such reports. The summary for the sector notes, contact with single enemy fighter, engagement inconclusive. It lists no confirmed victories or losses. The absence of claims is consistent across units operating in adjacent sectors during the same period. Captured documents reviewed post-war include training manuals and tactical bulletins circulated prior to the engagement. These documents emphasize visual confirmation of enemy fire as an indicator of threat level. The mention in the combat report of an enemy aircraft maneuvering without visible fire aligns with these criteria, though the documents themselves do not draw a connection. Further reconstruction is possible through comparison of time stamps. The opposing side's logs show the engagement ending slightly earlier than the return time recorded by the other side, suggesting a brief period of separation before each aircraft turned away. The opposing pilot's fuel state at disengagement is recorded as sufficient, with no urgency noted. Communications discipline on the opposing side remains consistent throughout the event. No emergency codes or priority messages are logged. The engagement is treated as routine, despite its duration. This is reflected in the absence of follow-up orders or changes to patrol patterns immediately afterward. Post-engagement correspondence between the opposing unit's operations staff and higher command includes a request for clarification regarding enemy numbers in the sector. The response notes limited intelligence and advises continued standard patrols. No reference is made to the specific behavior of the enemy aircraft beyond its continued maneuvering. Later intelligence assessments, compiled with access to broader data, include a brief mention of an enemy fighter observed remaining in combat after apparent cessation of fire. This mention is embedded in a list of observations and not expanded upon. The assessment does not attribute significance or draw conclusions. The opposing side's loss records for the day list no aircraft lost or damaged in the sector. Repair logs show routine maintenance only. Personnel casualty lists are unchanged. These records support the absence of decisive outcome during the engagement. Archival photographs associated with the opposing unit show aircraft parked after operations, indistinguishable from those taken on other days. No visual markers link them directly to the engagement. The photographs are dated and filed without commentary. In post-war interviews conducted decades later, some opposing personnel reference routine patrols and frequent inconclusive engagements. While these interviews are general and not tied explicitly to this event, they provide context for the type of documentation produced. The event itself remains unremarked upon in these narratives. Cross-referencing opposing radar logs with the other side's records shows alignment in timing and general movement, though discrepancies in altitude estimates persist. These discrepancies are typical of the limitations of the equipment and procedures in use at the time. The opposing side's archival reconstruction thus consists of parallel fragments, sortie logs, combat reports, observer notes, and maintenance records. Together, they outline an encounter with an enemy aircraft that remained present and maneuverable throughout the engagement, including a phase during which no enemy fire was observed. The records end with routine return and servicing entries, filed alongside numerous similar engagements that concluded without recorded loss or claim. No further annotations appear in the opposing archives that revisit or reassess the event. The documents remain as they were originally filed, presenting a sequence of recorded actions and observations that, when aligned with corresponding records from the other side, allow the engagement to be reconstructed in outline but not resolved beyond the factual limits of the surviving material. The remaining documents extend forward in time without reference back to the engagement. Daily operations continue, recorded in the same handwriting, on the same forms, using unchanged terminology. Aircraft serviceability tables are updated each morning. The aircraft involved appears again in these tables, marked operational after routine servicing. Engine hours increment by small, regular amounts. Ammunition issue forms for subsequent sorties show full loads drawn and signed for, the earlier notation of expended rounds no longer adjacent in the ledger. Maintenance records list scheduled inspections carried out at prescribed intervals. Spark plugs are cleaned or replaced. Filters are checked. Control cables are tensioned and recertified. The armament system undergoes standard synchronization checks. No repairs are attributed to combat damage. The airframe is washed, inspected, and returned to dispersal. Its serial number continues to appear in circulation among flight schedules. Pilot rosters rotate according to established patterns. Duty assignments shift between patrols, readiness, and rest periods. Flying hours accumulate evenly. No annotation distinguishes one sortie from another beyond time, duration, and fuel consumed. The pilot associated with the engagement is not reassigned, grounded, or singled out in subsequent paperwork. Training and operational requirements proceed uninterrupted. Intelligence summaries compiled in the days following list enemy activity in aggregate form. Numbers of contacts rise and fall. Headings, altitudes, and formation sizes are estimated and revised. Individual encounters are subsumed into broader statistical tables. The engagement in question is no longer identifiable as a discrete entry, its data absorbed into cumulative figures. Radar logs continue to fill with traces. Some are resolved, others discarded as interference or weather effects. Plotting symbols repeat across pages. Operators' initials change with shift rotations. The equipment calibration notes remain consistent, with occasional marginal adjustments noted and signed. No annotation refers back to earlier plots. Supply records indicate steady consumption of fuel, oil, and ammunition. Replacement stocks are requisitioned and delivered. Shortages are noted in general terms, prompting redistribution across units. These shortages are not linked to specific sorties. Ammunition accounting balances over weekly and monthly cycles. Higher command correspondence addresses broader operational concerns. Patrol coverage is adjusted in response to shifting front lines and intelligence estimates. Aircraft types are reassigned between sectors. These directives are issued as typed memoranda, carbon copied and distributed. They do not mention individual aircraft or pilots. Weather records accumulate daily entries. Pressure systems move across the region. Cloud layers rise and fall. Visibility varies within expected seasonal patterns. These reports continue to mirror those from opposing forces, though no comparison is made at the time. The weather becomes a backdrop of figures and codes, persistent and unremarked. Training manuals are updated incrementally. Amendments are inserted, pages replaced. Tactical diagrams are redrawn to reflect revised doctrine. These changes are dated and archived. No specific engagement is cited as justification. The manuals present general principles without reference to particular outcomes. As the conflict progresses, record-keeping practices adapt to material constraints. Paper quality declines. Ink fades more quickly. Some forms are reused, earlier entries crossed out or overwritten. Filing becomes less precise. Despite this, the structure of documentation remains recognizable. The aircraft's serial number continues to appear until it is eventually removed from active lists, replaced by another. The date of that removal is recorded without ceremony. A transfer notation indicates reassignment to a different unit or category. The reason is abbreviated, using a standard code. No narrative explanation accompanies the code. The aircraft's subsequent fate is not detailed in the same file. Personnel records follow similar patterns. Promotions, transfers, and leaves are entered as brief lines. Casualty lists are updated separately. The pilot's name appears intermittently, then less frequently, then not at all, as assignments change. No cross-reference ties these movements back to earlier sorties. Opposing archives show comparable continuities. Units rotate. Equipment changes. Records thin and thicken according to circumstance. The opposing pilot's name appears in later patrol logs, then disappears from the file without explanation. Replacement aircraft are issued. The earlier engagement remains unreferenced. Post-war consolidation of records brings disparate files together. Boxes are relabeled. Documents are sorted by date, unit, or category. Some material is deemed redundant and removed. Surviving files are stamped, indexed, and stored. The engagement exists now only as intersecting data points within larger collections. Archivists annotate some folders with brief descriptors. Most remain generic. The file containing the ammunition ledger is labeled by unit and date range only. The underlined entry remains visible but unexplained. No additional note is added to contextualize it. Researchers accessing the archive decades later request files by catalog number. They read through logs and reports in sequence. Some entries prompt cross-referencing. Others pass without notice. The engagement can be reconstructed only through alignment of times and locations, requiring comparison across multiple sources. The absence of narrative is itself part of the record. Technical specialists reviewing the armament logs note the complete expenditure of ammunition as a factual occurrence. They compare it with known capacities and firing rates. Their notes remain separate, analytical but limited to technical scope. They do not alter the original documents. Historical compilations include the sector's activity as part of broader chronologies. Tables list sorties flown, contacts made, losses recorded. The engagement contributes to these numbers without being individually named. The aircraft's survival is implicit in the absence of loss entries. Photographic archives from the period show airfields, aircraft, and personnel in static poses. Dates and locations are noted. The aircraft type appears among others, indistinguishable in lineups. No caption references ammunition expenditure or engagement duration. Oral histories collected later include generalized descriptions of patrols, encounters, and returns. Speakers recall patterns rather than specifics. Memory compresses events. The engagement does not emerge distinctly in these accounts. Where similar situations are mentioned, they are not linked to dates or files. The archival trail gradually thins as wartime documentation gives way to post-war administrative records. Units are disbanded or reorganized. Equipment inventories are closed out. Final reports summarize assets on hand at cessation. The aircraft is no longer listed. In storage, the paper continues to age. Ink fades. Edges curl. Some pages are digitized, others remain only in physical form. The underlined ledger entry remains legible, though lighter than before. It sits between entries of similar appearance, its emphasis subtle. The records do not close with a concluding statement. They stop when entries are no longer made. The engagement ends in the archive not with resolution, but with continuation into routine, then into absence. What remains is a sequence of documents, aligned by date and procedure, tapering into silence as the administrative process moves on to other matters and finally to none at all.